Chapter 7. Return from Exile. History of Israel Persian. Rule and the Rebuilding of the Temple. Ezra and Nehemiah's. Reforms, cultural and religious revival. At dawn over ruins the morning sun rose pale and hesitant over Jerusalem, spilling light over a city that was more memory than reality. From the Mount of Olives, one could look down and see the skeletal outlines of walls, long fallen, the jagged stumps of gates, and the Temple Mount where the heart of Israel's faith had once pulsed with fire and song. In the still air, the wind carried only the faintest echo of what had been, the chanting of priests, the lowing of sacrificial cattle, the aroma of incense curling upward toward heaven. Now there was only stone and silence. Yet on this particular morning, a caravan was winding its way toward the city gates, or rather, toward the gap where those gates had once stood. Their robes were dust-stained, their faces weathered by long travel, but their eyes held something more precious than gold or weapons, the unshakable determination of returnees. 70 years had passed since Babylon's armies had carried their ancestors into exile, scattering them into the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, under the unexpected decree of a foreign king, they were coming home. In the crowd, a young boy clung to his father's cloak. He had never seen Jerusalem before. The stories had been his only guide. "Is this the place?" he whispered. His father, a man born in captivity, nodded with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Yes," he said, "this is Zion, our home." Main narrative. From Babylon to Judah. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE was one of those moments in history that seemed to pivot the fate of nations with a single sweep. The conqueror was Cyrus II of Persia, known to later generations as Cyrus the Great. His armies entered Babylon not as destroyers, but as liberators, at least in the eyes of many subjected peoples. Where Babylon had exiled and humiliated, Persia sought loyalty through restoration. Cyrus's policy was revolutionary for its time. Allow displaced peoples to return to their homelands, rebuild their sanctuaries, and worship their own gods, so long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. For the Jewish exiles, this was nothing less than a miracle. The prophet Isaiah, writing decades earlier, had spoken of a coming anointed one, a Messiah who would free Israel. Astonishingly, Isaiah's words would be applied to Cyrus, a foreign monarch whom God had supposedly raised up for this very purpose. The Edict of Cyrus, recorded in the opening lines of the book of Ezra, was a lifeline thrown across the wilderness of exile. "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem. Whoever among you belongs to his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the house of the Lord." The first wave of returnees, numbering perhaps 40,000, was led by Sheshbazzar, a Judean prince of the Davidic line. They carried with them not only supplies and beasts of burden, but also the sacred vessels of the temple, gold and silver objects looted by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier, now restored by the Persian treasury. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem stretched some 900 miles, a slow crawl across rivers, mountains, and desert. At night, the exiles camped under the same stars that had shone over Abraham, their father in faith. The rebuilding of the temple, when the exiles finally reached Jerusalem, the sight was sobering. The city was a shell of itself. Grass and weeds sprouted where once there had been courtyards and markets. Wild animals prowled the ruined streets. The Temple Mount, that sacred hill where Solomon's glorious temple had stood, was nothing but an empty plateau of rubble. Yet the returnees wasted little time. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, likely the same figure as Sheshbazzar in some records, and Joshua the high priest, they rebuilt the altar of burnt offerings. It was a small beginning, but symbolically immense. Before walls or houses, the people restored the place where they could offer sacrifices and call upon the name of the Lord. In 536 BCE, they laid the foundation of the new temple. The event was marked by both jubilation and grief. Ezra records that as the priests blew their trumpets and the Levites sang the Psalms of David, many of the older men who had seen Solomon's temple began to weep aloud. Their tears were not of joy, but of mourning for what had been lost, for the grandeur that could never be fully recaptured. But opposition soon arose. The local Samaritans, descendants of Israelites who had remained in the land after the Assyrian conquest, offered to help build the temple. When their offer was refused, the returnees insisting on purity of worship and lineage, resentment boiled over. Letters were sent to the Persian court, accusing the Jews of planning rebellion. Under political pressure, the rebuilding was halted for nearly 2 decades. It was only in the reign of Darius, the first, that the project resumed. Encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the people threw themselves into the work. In 516 BCE, exactly 70 years after the destruction, the Second Temple was completed and dedicated. While humbler than Solomon's, it restored the heart of Jewish worship. The sacrifices resumed, the festivals returned, and the covenant rituals found their home once more. Ezra and the revival of the law decades passed. The Persian Empire expanded and solidified its rule from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Judah, now a small province called Yehud, lived under the watchful eye of Persian governors. It was during this quiet but significant period that 2 remarkable figures emerged to shape the soul of post-exilic Judaism: Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra, a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, arrived in Jerusalem around 458 BCE with a fresh wave of exiles. His mission was not to build walls or altars, but to rebuild the very identity of the people. During the years in Babylon, much of Israel's cultural and religious memory had been preserved through careful study and copying of the Torah. Ezra's task was to re-anchor the returned community in that covenant. One scene in the book of Nehemiah captures the spirit of this revival with cinematic clarity. On a bright autumn morning, the people gathered in a square before the water gate. Ezra climbed onto a wooden platform, unrolled the scroll, and began to read the law aloud. As the words poured forth, the people stood in reverent silence. Many began to weep, struck by the realization of how far they had strayed from the commands of their God. Levites moved among the crowd, explaining the meaning of the text, ensuring that everyone, men, women, and children, understood. This was no mere religious ceremony. It was the reconstitution of a nation. In that moment, the people of Yehud were not just survivors of exile. They were the covenant people again. Ezra's reforms were strict. He confronted intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, insisting that such unions threatened the purity of the community's faith. This policy, controversial then and now, underscored the deep anxieties of a small people surrounded by larger and often hostile cultures. Nehemiah, the wall builder. If Ezra was the restorer of the soul, Nehemiah was the builder of the body. Serving as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah enjoyed a position of rare trust in the Persian court. When news reached him that Jerusalem's walls were still in ruins decades after the temple's completion, he was deeply grieved. In ancient cities, walls were more than fortifications. They were the visible sign of security, dignity, and independence. Granted leave by the king, Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem in 445 BCE. He inspected the city by night, riding along the broken ramparts, noting every breach and heap of rubble. His plan was bold: to rebuild the walls in record time despite fierce opposition from neighboring governors like Sanballat of Samaria and Tobiah the Ammonite. The work was carried out with both tools and weapons in hand. One group laid stones, while another stood guard with spears and bows. Women and men, priests and merchants, goldsmiths and farmers, all labored side by side. Against all odds, the walls were completed in just 52 days. The dedication was a festival of triumph, with choirs marching atop the newly built ramparts, their voices echoing into the valleys. Nehemiah's governorship was marked by social reforms as well. He canceled debts, confronted corrupt officials, and ensured that the poor were not exploited. His leadership gave the small province a measure of stability and dignity in the vast Persian world. The birth of a new Judaism, the return from exile, was not simply a matter of going home. In many ways, the Jews who rebuilt Jerusalem were a new people. The trauma of the exile had stripped away illusions of invincibility. Never again would they take the covenant for granted. Under Persian rule, Judah was no longer a kingdom, but a religious community. Without a Davidic king, the high priest and the scribes became central figures. The law read, explained, and obeyed became the constitution of the nation. In this period, many scholars see the roots of what would later be called Judaism, a faith centered not on political sovereignty, but on the worship of one God through obedience to his Torah. The rebuilding of the temple gave the community a spiritual center, but the reading of the law gave them a cultural and moral spine. Ezra and Nehemiah's insistence on separation from surrounding peoples reflected a survival strategy. In the melting pot of the Persian Empire, where languages, gods, and customs mingled freely, maintaining distinctiveness was the key to not being absorbed and forgotten. A wall around the heart, the Persian period would eventually give way to the conquests of Alexander the Great and the storm of Hellenistic politics. But the legacy of the return from exile endured. The walls Nehemiah built could be breached in future centuries. The temple could be destroyed again. But the law, once written into the hearts of the people, could travel with them anywhere. On the last night of the dedication feast, Nehemiah walked the walls alone. Lantern light flickered on the freshly set stones. Below, the city lay quiet, its gates barred against the darkness. Above, the stars burned, the same stars that had shone over Abraham, over Moses, over the exiles returning with hope in their eyes. For all the fragility of human empires, there was something enduring here. A people who, having once lost everything, had learned how to rebuild not just their city, but their very soul.